Welcome to Unpacked, the podcast that examines how technology is reshaping business and our world. This season is all about generative AI. My name's Stuart Black, and I'm joined by Think Tank's innovation lead, Arvind Ravishankar. Arvind, how are you today?
Hey Stuart, great to see you again. Your furry sweater makes me believe you're in a bit of a colder climate right now. Are you cold out there?
Well, I'll let you into a secret. This is known as the teddy bear jumper. My 2-year-old son just loves cuddling it. So hot or cold, I end up having to wear it for his benefit. So it is a bit chilly, but it's really about my son. So yeah, I hope it doesn't look too soft and fluffy.
Stuart. I love that. You know, I have a similar robe, which I love, and for the same reasons, right? Same reasons. This is amazing. Yep.
You gotta have something that feels nice and cozy and cuddly in this kind of season.
Yeah, that's that's amazing. It's such a nice story.
Okay, enough about our fluffy jumpers. In a few minutes, we're going to dive into Arvind's interview with Nick Brady, who works at Microsoft Azure OpenAI team. Arvind, can you just tell us a little bit about what to expect?
Sure, Stuart. Nick Brady has a really interesting job. He comes with a PhD in computer science, so he's a deep technical background. But what he's doing at Microsoft is he's leveraging that technical background to help customers figure out how to deploy the new generative AI technology. So he sees customers day in and day out. So he's a wealth of information on how to actually use generative AI technology. And so he's going to be sharing that with us. How should companies deploy this? How should they use it? And what should they consider when they're using generative AI?
All right, sounds fascinating. But before we get to that, we're going to look at a couple of events happening in the AI world. Our first story today is all about Coca-Cola and a controversial new product from them that's been co-created with AI. The marketing strategy here was to imagine a flavor from the future, which they've done, and that's being called, I think, Y3000 Zero Sugar, if you can get your head around that. Alongside the drink itself is an experience also developed with AI, and this is all centered on the concept of stable diffusion somehow. The design involves morphing colors and forms, and there's also an app you can get for your phone which will distort images to match with the product. Arvind, are you as confused by this as I am? Is it wacky? Is it cool? What's your take?
It's actually super cool, Stuart. And let's unpack that a little bit, right? And we'll unpack what the controversy is. We'll unpack what Coke is doing. So what's super cool is that Coke is in the forefront of innovation with this, right? Where they are leveraging the power of artificial intelligence to develop new flavors. So kudos to them, right? That's what any innovative company should be doing. Every company should be looking at how do I use and leverage AI for innovation, right? It's one of its capabilities. Now, the controversial part of this, interestingly, it actually, while it's indirectly has something to do with Coke, in reality, this controversy applies to anybody using AI. That's the interesting part. And let me unpack that quickly. Stable diffusion is a foundation AI model that is built on data from the internet, and it learns from images on the internet. And these images a lot of times are copyright images, right? So given that the AI model was built on learning from some of these copyrighted images, when it creates a new image, should it credit those previous artists who put up their images on the internet? That's the controversy, right? And the thing is, governments and regulations haven't figured this out yet. They haven't figured out how to regulate. Even all AI foundation models are built on public data, most of them, right? And so the copyright aspects and the copyright infringement is something that governments are yet figuring out. Regulators are still figuring out. So it's not just Coke, it's everybody who's using AI is in the similar position as them. So I want to unpack that, right, to make sure that it's separate, right? It's not Coke, it's all foundation models or all AI. And what Coke is doing is pretty cool, actually. They're using it and giving you the power of that application, allowing you to develop your own images. It's kind of cool. We'll see how it plays out, but I think it's cool.
And the legals around the copyright problem, it feels like there's a lot of knots to untangle there. How do you see it playing out, just in broad terms? Is this going to be over quickly, or are we going to be talking about this in 10 years' time?
No, we're going to be talking about it for a while, right? And it's not going to happen that easily. It's going to be a messy process, because all of us learn from other people's, like even you and me, right, Stuart? We learn from things we see. We learn from images, from data. How do you really determine if what you've learned is from something copyrighted? And if humans can learn, like if you see an image tomorrow and it sparks your imagination and you create something new, do you have to be sued? Right? If a human doesn't have to be sued, how would... So I think there's a lot to discuss and unpack on this. It's not an easy subject. It's going to take a while for us to figure it out.
An episode all to itself, doesn't it? I'm sure we'll get to that in a
Yes,
future.
actually, you're right. And, we will do an episode on AI and regulations, and we'll bring in someone who's an expert, and I'm sure they'll be able to unpack this for us.
Okay, well, that takes the burden off our shoulders. Our second story is all
Exactly.
about... Our second story is all about bringing conversational AI chatbots that can recognize and respond to human emotions into communications between companies and their customers. Nice Enlighten is the name of this purpose-built AI that aims to improve customer experience with more intuitive and efficient interactions that can align better with brand values. And this is going to work alongside existing automated communication and actual human contact. So it's easy to see why this can benefit companies, but it will require a shift in perceptions from their customers, I would have thought. Arvind, is this going to be an easy journey to implement this kind of stuff?
Well, let's draw from your own experience here, Stuart. Have you gone to a website and today, have you ever used those chatbots that come up on the site? What's been your experience, if you can recollect one or two?
Well, it's a mixed bag, isn't it? Sometimes they can answer simple problems quite quickly and you can move on with your day, and other times you feel like you get a bit lost in double speak and glitches, and it's not quite delivering what you need it to deliver. So I'd say it's a bit of a mixed bag, but what do you think?
Yeah, and I've always found it's also very generic, right?
Right.
Like it gives you very standardized output, So honestly, I rarely use chatbots because of that. My experience is kind of, it's been colored by the fact that the chatbots aren't truly powered by artificial intelligence. So one of the things that companies have to consider as they deploy the new generation of AI technology, which is able to converse, which will break that monotony, which will not give you standard answers, but will give you answers based on the context of your conversation. They may have to think about new ways of deploying it, because if I see a chatbot on a side window, I'm going to associate it, at least the average consumer will associate it to the past experiences, which have not been great. So it's not enough if you just power your AI conversations with generative AI with your customers. But how do you build that interface with the customer to communicate that, hey, this is something you should pay attention to? Or how do you draw them to use this conversational interface? I think that's going to be huge. And focusing there for the next 1 year till this stabilizes or till it takes off is going to be important. So don't just use the technology. Really figure out how your consumers are responding to it. How do you build that into your website? In some cases, right, Stuart? In fact, in some cases, it'll be even interesting to see if you can integrate it into the website. So, and I'm sure Nick Brady today will have a lot more to say about that.
Great stuff. One of the interesting things about the article for me was this idea that the chatbots will get to know our emotions. They can see when we're frustrated. They can see when we're satisfied with the results. What does this mean with the AIs actually understanding us more? Will they start judging us? Where does this lead?
Yeah, you're right. Interestingly, AI itself will not judge us, but the humans that build these AI systems and interpret it, they may judge, right? But it is true with computer vision and the fact that all our computers have cameras. If you give access AI will be able to evaluate your emotions. And it's a mix, it's a two-sided coin, right? On one case, maybe I want AI to know that I'm happy today and it gives me some interesting recommendations. But on the other side, I don't want it to manipulate me because it knows my emotions versus a normal human being who may not be as in tune to my emotional state. AI may be a lot more in tune because it can recognize all those minute body language, my face, how I'm talking. So it honestly, the people who deploy it, the companies that deploy these, their intentions, I think, Stuart, is going to determine the end outcome, right? But initially, as a consumer, I would be more wary, and that's because that's how I am, right? I will be a little more wary to give up my emotions and things like that early on because I don't know the companies and what their intentions are.
Arvind, in a moment we'll have your deep dive interview with Nick Brady. Can you just tell us a little bit more about the topics you'll be discussing today?
Yeah, I think the key thing that I'm going to be talking to Nick about is how should companies figure out use cases for this new generative AI technology, right? That's the key thing. And I think it's really important for all companies because you hear about the shiny object called generative AI, it's all over the news. But the question is, how do you deploy it within your own company? And how do you leverage it? How do you improve productivity? Those are some of the things we're going to be talking about.
Great stuff. Well, without further ado, here's Arvind talking with Nick Brady. Our think tank focuses on researching emerging technologies that will shape your future. From generative AI to exoskeletons, we study the impact these technologies will have on business, humanity, and our planet. And through our podcast, newsletters, and social media content, we have a direct line to a truly global emerging technology community. So if you'd like to find out more about the impact these technologies will have on your business, then reach out to our team at lab45thinktank.com.
GPT 3.5, the foundation model behind ChatGPT, is 175 billion parameters. What does that actually mean? Does it matter to you as a business? Does the size of the LLM you choose behind your AI strategy, is it going to affect your business? What use cases can you use these LLMs in? Should you go for an open sourced versus a closed sourced LLM? And which LLM should you choose? What kind of performance metrics should you be talking to your team about as you develop your AI strategy? These are all questions that you most probably have as a business as you are deploying AI inside your products and services. And today I have a special guest to help me unpack these different questions. He has his bachelor's and master's from Purdue in computer science. He has been traveling the world advising clients and helping them unpack the complex technology behind artificial intelligence. Started his career at Best Buy on the Geek Squad, helping customers understand technology. And then from there, joined Microsoft. He's currently the senior program manager at Microsoft's OpenAI program and service. And he now spends his time traveling the world, helping customers understand artificial intelligence and also help bring practical advice to AI. He gives keynotes regularly and he's featured in some of Microsoft's own podcasts. So I'm super happy to bring in the senior manager for Microsoft's OpenAI service, Nick Brady. Welcome.
Thank you, Arvin. I really appreciate the time and opportunity we'll get a chance to spend today.
As of November 2022, we understood that artificial intelligence can help us in ways we never thought about before. Could you talk a little bit about, in the last 7-8 months, as you are working with different customers, what are some real use cases you are seeing people deploy this in today?
The use cases are quite easy to sort of grasp and understand there. With generative technology and generative AI, because these models have literally been trained on trillions of words, the interesting thing about generative AI is it can do nearly any natural language task that you think of. So when I consult customers that are trying to understand how to wrap their mind around how this could be used, not to reduce business cost in their organizations, but to maximize business value, productivity, and downstream that could lead to employee satisfaction, customer satisfaction, and these sorts of things. Any space within your organizations where there's a lot of language, and this could be programming language too, right? It doesn't have to just be, natural language in this construct. Any place where there's language is a good use case for generative AI. And I think that's probably the most profound shift that I'm trying to help customers get out of that mindset of, well, what are the use cases? Well, the use cases are every use case, right? So if you have language, if you have a document, if you have, big data where you're trying to sort of synthesize and understand what that content and what the context is, generative AI models can do this, ad nauseum, like, without, any, delay. Whereas for humans, it just takes us a ton of time. Imagine if my job every day were to read documents and then summarize them. Like, I would quickly probably burn out on this task. But the people that need that summarization of those documents have new productivity gains before they click into that research paper or article, or just to get the top insights to glean before they move on to the next thing. That's super useful and productive for users that need that sort of work, right?
That's really interesting. I was reading this paper by a professor at Harvard Business School called Linda Hill. And she was talking about how, because of the speed of innovation today and the change in technology, it's better to understand strategy bottoms up than tops down. So, if I were to draw a correlation here, what I'm hearing, Nick, is that you have this powerful technology, right? Open it up in some way with some guardrails, obviously, to your employee base and let them come out with the use cases and tell you as a leader on where the maximum impact is going to be, right? Rather than go top down to say, okay, these are the 4 areas I'm going to target. I mean, is that how you're thinking about this? Is that the correlation?
Yeah, very honestly, like, customers will ask me often, like, how should I be approaching this? Like, do we need to build a centralized team that goes and basically fields the business requirements at the line level and then just goes and builds those things? Like, that might have worked for like traditional applications in the past, but if you don't make the folks that are actually doing most of that work a part of the solution, they're going to feel like a part of the problem, because we talked about that whole science fiction thing. Well, they probably, you know read literature and pay attention to art and entertainment too. And so their resident knowledge, their domain knowledge, is filled with fear about what AI can do to them, or potentially harm them. So if they can be involved in that innovation, that process, and we at Microsoft, we call these sort of things like fusion teams, right? Where you can take non-technical and folks as well as technical folks to work together to build solutions that help solve those problems for them. And it gives them agency and makes them feel like they have some ownership with this, and it usually naturally increases adoption rate from those users, right? Because they were a part of that solution from the start. And two, it in general helps make it be a little bit easier, and they can focus on the challenges in their daily job and lives that matter most. And I think that's probably one of the most rewarding ways in which organizations could set up this culture of innovation.
So we hear a lot about the size of these LLMs, right? Like, can you break that down for our audience here? 175 billion parameters. What does that mean? And does it even matter to someone who's trying to work with AI?
Yeah, for those that are unacquainted to that specific number, 175 billion parameters speaks to the third generation of generative pre-trained transformers from OpenAI, so GPT-3, which was created in 2020. So, it's almost 3 years ago. But at the time when that model was trained, it was an order of magnitude larger than the largest model that was ever created in 2020. The interesting thing about parameters is it's actually not a direct correlation to how powerful the model might be. The parameter size refers to essentially the number of values that the model can change independently as it learns from data. And so it stores all of this information in its vast associative array of memory in its model weights. And what's perhaps more important for these models, and it speaks to more of their capability, is their vocabulary size. So when you train large language models like this, you give it trillions of samples of text, like trillions of words. And as it goes on to try to predict the next amount of words, like the way you sort of break these down for generative pre-trained formers is you convert words to tokens. Those tokens are usually word chunks, which get converted to integers. So actually machines can even read human language to begin with. Like these models obviously don't know anything about language, which is perhaps the most profound and more surprising thing. But by converting them to these tokens, like we like to call them, it can predict the pattern of tokens that need to actually be put together until it reaches the end of text. And it does this because it literally learns in batches of the billions and trillions of text over time that it gets a pretty good idea of what's the statistical probability that this next token comes after the preceding tokens, right? So then, it does its prediction, and then we actually give it the real value, and then it goes and picks up a new batch and tries to learn from that sample too. The model has to learn a lot of things about language in that process. And this is where the largest language models, like 175 billion parameters, or like GPT-4, which doesn't have a disclosed amount of parameters, is that they start to gain emergent capabilities, meaning that these models learn new capabilities just through more iterations and more time sampling this data. When we're talking about this data, it might be helpful for customers to understand and just users, like, what is this data? Is it my data? Is it my company's data? Like, what's happening here? I mean, and almost all of these models have a training data mixture. So you need to bring in more diverse data sets too that represent humans. And this also means that we need to bring in more language, right? Just beyond English. And this is where you start to get some separation. When you look at models like the GPT-based models from OpenAI and from Meta and from the Palm-based models that Google has, these are multilingual models. They've sampled languages from a variety of different backgrounds and diversity, and so there is no like official language support for these models. They just have seen so much language over the internet that it does a pretty good job of learning new languages and generalizing to them pretty quickly. Which again, that's like an emerging capability where these models have the ability to translate, not because they know how to translate, but because they've seen so many examples of that language itself. And so that's like one of the more profound things. When you get into these open source models that are supervised, fine-tuned, and like shared with the world, like first of all, some of these are like not available for a commercial license, so they're not really intended to be used for commercial use. But many of them are English only, and that's a real problem, especially for multinational enterprises and organizations that have diverse employees and diverse customers that speak in many different languages. So there's a lot of considerations when you think about using these. The best practice really is to start with GPT-4. As being the most powerful and advanced language model to date, test to see if it's even possible with your use case. And you can find that you could probably get 90% of the way there with just a little bit of prompt engineering. And
I
then you
like
can
it.
optimize for cost after the fact, right? Actually looking for lesser capable models that can achieve the same or on par with the same task that GPT-4 can do. And then only then should you really look at doing fine tuning of those models after the fact. But that's the general recipe. It's like start with GPT-4 with any natural language task that you can think of, see how close you can get to meet your business requirement, and then optimize for costs afterwards.
So Nick, this is fascinating. The 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 size of the model finally translates to essentially the emergent capabilities. That's the magic, right? The large volume of data that this model is trained on has led to it have these emergent capabilities such as inference, summarization, translation, etc. So when you take some of the smaller models, right? So for example, um, there's a model being developed in the medical industry where the only thing that the model has studied is medical journals and publications, right?
Yeah.
It's a 2 billion parameter model. And so it's sort of a narrow model, right? The only thing it knows is the medical journals and publications. How would you compare something like that with GPT-4? Would we also see emergent capabilities there, or would we not see those emergent capabilities?
Yeah, I mean the fascinating thing, especially is like folks need to realize that these models themselves are tools, right? Right. So when we were talking about like parameter size, it's not the only determination for LLM performance. Like other factors such as quality and quantity of the training data become really important for optimizing the model for the task. We've seen this with models like Bloomberg GPT, which is like a financial services based domain specific model. It's going to be really good perhaps in financial services based data, but it doesn't have any capability outside of that. What's interesting about approaching this with things like GPT-4 is without fine tuning, you can almost instruct the model that it's a financial services expert and its objective or its mission is to assist customers in the finance industry. And the model sort of just tunes itself to putting on that hat of being a financial services advisor or an assistant to that advisor. And we actually see better results and performance out of GPT-4 than even domain specific models.
Are you suggesting that the reasoning capability of GPT-4, because of the amount of data that it's seen, is going to be better than a model that has only seen financial data, right? Because GPT-4 seen science, math, a lot of other areas, right? So does that translate in the real world for our customers? Would it translate to better reasoning? Like what does that translate to in real world applications when
Yeah.
customers are deploying these models?
I think what we've seen is that these models have the ability to have some sort of reasoning, but at the end of the day, it's just mimicking what reasoning it's seen from all of the representations of language. Uh, it's hard to be able to understand whether the model actually knows how to reason. Right? Like so, that's a really difficult sort of concept to think about with these models and how that applies. But I think the assertion is correct, Arvin, right? Which is just because the data is more diverse and more generalized to every domain, in general, it's going to be better in finance because it has more diversity of thought, right, through its vast associative array memory. There are things in other domains that are not unique to finance, but could be useful for the model to know to improve its results. And I think because of that very notion, these models appear to have better reasoning capabilities, arguably whether it's reasoning or not, or whether it's just mimicking reasoning and it does a really good job at it, right?
So taking a foundation model and fine tuning it may lead to better results than just building a narrow model, right? In one particular domain.
The interesting thing with fine tuning, as we've seen it, is so if I am in the financial services domain and I have some sort of ontology or taxonomy that I want the model to be able to know and understand based upon a bunch of ideal assistant responses for classification that I train it with, Microsoft Research actually invented LoRa to be able to fine tune these models, and so this is widely the approach that's used today for fine tuning. What we've actually found that's almost a better approach than thinking about fine tuning first is actually what's called retrieval augmented generation. I'm going to go to my information retrieval system. As a consumer, this is the public internet, like Google, Bing, or whatever, right? And I type in this phrase, could be keyword or natural language based, and then I get 10 magical blue links. And if I don't feel like I like the results, I go back and refine my keyword search. What's happened now with GPT-3 and ChatGPT and now where we're at today is we flipped all the way over to memory only based retrieval, which is we stopped relying on these internet search capabilities because of the output we were getting from these models alone. But if I were to ask a model from today, like what was the weather like yesterday, or even for older models like GPT-3, like who won the NBA Finals in 2023, the model will think, oh, it's like 2023 hasn't even happened yet, and it will just sort of fail to complete that instruction. But there's actually this happy medium. And what retrieval augmented generation is when a user passes a query like who won the NBA Finals in 2023, it actually, at query time, we can go and retrieve that information from Google or Bing. And then we ask the large language model before it ever sees the user's question to only generate answers from what's retrieved. And then it sees the user's question. And then we ask, based upon that context, what's the answer? So now you're no longer relying on how up to date the language model's training data is or its recency bias. Like the way I like to sort of describe that, if people are familiar with the famous movie of Bill Murray called Groundhog Day, it's where he's sort of like stuck in perpetuity of the same day, not being able to get out of it and like move on. And that's like this state, the state that these GPT based models are in. They've learned all the way up to Groundhog Day, and they never learn anything new from any of their interactions that they have with users. I find in these discussions I have with executives and customers the world over, like that's the most profound like learning that they get from these models at all. They thought that they are learning with every interaction. Now there are a couple things that may be true here, right? Like it can be possible that if a SaaS-based application who uses generative AI as a feature, they can and probably do collect those prompts and responses that users use to go back and improve their models. And so this is where it's really important for enterprises, organizations, and users to understand the terms of use. What are you doing with my personal data? What are you doing with my company data? And are you using my data and interactions with these models to improve them? If you know from OpenAI, they've increased their security posture for the last several months. Starting back in March, they were no longer improving their models through the API, right? So this is like a huge security requirement for a lot of organizations. But moreover, like it also became an opt-in, not an opt-out, to use ChatGPT to improve these models. So even if you were using the free service today, OpenAI is not using any of the interactions that you have to train the model. They just
That's
released last week in a
that's
private
more
ChatGPT,
that's
right?
more reassuring. Nick, why? So if I can leverage the reasoning capabilities and these emerging or mimicking reasoning capabilities and the logic and the emergent capabilities of GPT-4, and if I can ground it in this retrieval augmentation system so that I know that the facts are more real and more current, why has OpenAI, or I don't know if Azure is offering the same thing? They also have these other versions of the same model, right? The smaller parameter versions. What is the purpose of releasing those, and how should customers think about that?
The way I like to describe this to organizations, and this is why I was talking about as you start to develop your use cases, start with GPT-4 first, and then optimize for cost later. You have to just pressure test to see that your use case is even possible. But second, all of these smaller models are less capable of doing the most complex tasks that GPT-4 is capable of doing. So in the case of summarization or conversational based constructs, the more capable models can are more capable of handling conversation where context is incredibly important. These lesser capable models aren't good at doing conversation, but they're much better at less complex natural language tasks. You can think of that as text parsing or sentiment analysis or entity extraction. And so you want to pick the right model to do the right job, right? And unfortunately, people have seen how good GPT-4 is with every single natural language task. That's the only thing that they want to use. So oftentimes my advice is like when all you have is a hammer, when everything looks like a nail, like GPT-4 is the Mjolnir of hammers, and you don't need a magical hammer to do text parsing. It's a very expensive way to do that task, but there are faster, LLMs that are lesser capable to achieve state-of-the-art performance without a premium call to GPT-4 every time you need to do a job. Does that make sense? Like, it's like if you have like a circle of friends and you know like this person is really good in sports trivia, like you would only ask that friend for sports advice. Like you wouldn't ask your financial advisor or your girlfriend or whomever, right? Like you pick on the expert that's really good at that thing and can get you the answer really fast. GPT-4 is like the smartest know-it-all that's so annoying with how good it is with its answers that you don't want to ask them all the time. But you want to make sure, like just a pressure test that, hey, is it possible that I can get this done? GPT-4 can help you do that. And then there's other models that can do some of those tasks equally as well.
Let's say a client wants to develop a chat bot on their website. It's a retail client and they're trying to develop a chat bot to help customers answer questions about products, services. They want to bring that ability of language and interaction and make the customer feel at home. In those kind of applications, is it possible to use the lower end models or would you have to use a GPT-4?
Yeah, this is where a lot of the work in maturing these sort of capabilities becomes really, really important for customers to consider. This is where you could probably use an ensemble of multiple large language models behind the scenes to handle certain tasks. An example might be if you are a sales manager and you want to see, like how many coffee sales that you had in this particular region last month. GPT-4 is probably the most capable model for doing a natural language to SQL query or any sort of structured query language by which the model itself is not going to give you the answer. The model is going to write the SQL query necessary to transact and extract the information from that database. And then I could use something like GPT-3.5 Turbo, the turbo-based model that's based off of the old GPT-3 version, to then go and take that result and answer back to that user in natural language. You sold 57,000 cups of coffee, in this region last month, right? That the use of actually using multiple LLM calls downstream to go and achieve a larger task or instruction is where you're going to start to see a lot of sophistication in the coming years with customers building this orchestration layer, classifying what the query is and what expert I need to go and call to go and achieve that task.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I almost think you can redefine what that customer experience is going to be, right?
That's
And
right.
pretty much redefine your website, right? Rather than have that little chatbot
That's
in the
right.
corner, your entire website can go through a redefinition. There are now many LLMs in the market. And when you look at a side by side comparison, um, do you choose LLMs based on your applications? Do you choose LLMs based on cost? What are some of the factors you got to take into account?
Yeah, I mean,
When you have all these multiple LLMs out there?
I think for organizations, they have to define what quality means to them. It could be the model's output in essentially its core response. Could be the most important factor for performance for them. For use cases where you're maybe serving millions of customers or tens or hundreds of thousands of employees with a particular model, it could be that you have a very sensitive latency budget and the quality of the output may not be as important as how quickly we can respond back to the user. So if they needed to follow up with a different question or instruction, they could quickly do so without waiting for multiple seconds for this generative AI model to produce a result. And so I think the biggest factors that organizations need to think about is what does quality mean to them in terms of the quality of the output, the latency or the response time it takes for that model to generate that particular thing for that said task, and what is the performance of those, or the delta between them, that's most important for them. Like those two factors primarily is probably what affects the model choice the most.
Makes sense. Quality, latency, and what about cost, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, look, the wild thing about generative AI today is, and every time that OpenAI has released a new service or new model, it's reduced in price. So like, there's optimizing that's happening with these massive offerings that we have today, where just in the orders of magnitude, the more people that use and adopt the service, the cheaper it gets for everybody. One of the ways in which organizations are combating this for cost optimization is when a query gets submitted in a conversational based use case, you might have a very efficient large language model that's fine tuned to classify that user's query first before you take a premium call to GPT-4. Because if it could be done by GPT-3.5 Turbo or Claude or Llama or some other model, even that extra LLM which costs something, it's probably 20 times cheaper than to call GPT-4 every time, right?
Yeah,
So
no, it makes sense. Build that interface layer to understand. Yeah, which ones to send it to. That totally makes sense. Um, the Along with these other parameters like cost, latency, and performance, quality, like open sourced versus closed sourced, does that impact a company's strategy when it comes to AI? What are sort of the pros and cons?
in my opinion, you should use the best model to get the task done, right? But as we mentioned earlier, with all of the RLHF based models, these are really good for conversation based tasks, and they're multilingual. Most of them are, but most of the open source models are English only. So it's probably the most important consideration for thinking about open source to begin with. The thing that concerns me the most about open source is that innovation is happening so quickly that if we have too powerful of models in the open source, of course, there is a risk that bad actors can use these to exploit and harm individuals. And that's the scariest thing, is that the open source community is probably leaning not equally as hard on how do we mitigate risks of these open source models. And that's where groups like Microsoft and OpenAI and Google and Anthropic are building safety guardrails and safety into the models themselves, or building safety systems around those APIs so that we can protect people from being exploited. And that's my biggest concern about open source models. But in used in non-human interaction based things like this.
Like, just you've been amazing answering all these tough questions. Just a couple of more for us to close out today's conversation. First one is, so for our audience, is GPT-4 available for them to license their own instance, host it in their own servers, and work on it?
Yeah, so the way that GPT-4 is made available today, both by Microsoft and OpenAI, is we host these models on our customers' behalf. You know, the benefit that customers gain from that is that, one, you don't have to manage the most expensive AI infrastructure on the planet, and customers get a lot of heartburn having to manage all that infrastructure. And obviously, since Microsoft is in the business of building technology so that others can build technology on top of that. And so today, when you apply for Azure OpenAI Service Access, you get access to these powerful models.
And these instances of and these access to these models, they can be exclusive to a particular firm, right? Just to be clear. And you can have your own instance sitting in the Azure server of GPT-4 that you could use or you could fine tune.
That's right. So today, like Azure OpenAI Service, when you create a resource, it's logically isolated and separated from every other customer in that region. So you still have, safe transacting with these models that's secure. You're just using shared infrastructure to be able to handle the data processing so that we can optimize for utilization and of that infrastructure, and we can pass the cost savings back to the customer.
Fantastic. Awesome, Nick. Last question. I'm not able to get a good answer on this on the internet or anywhere. What what does it truly cost to build a foundation model? Are we looking, and you don't have to give me an exact answer, are we looking at tens of millions of dollars or hundreds
Yeah,
of millions or billions? What is the actual cost?
yeah. I mean, look, it's not trivial. It's still very much in this research territory. So, just to give you a couple of examples, like Llama in 2023, it has a vocabulary size of about 32,000 tokens. It's a 65 billion parameter model, trained on over 1 trillion tokens. It took over 2,000 A100 GPUs trained over 21 days, in parallel. And the training cost, as advertised by Meta in their paper, was a small sum of $5 million, right? And so you can expect of models of similar size to, be that expensive too. Similarly with GPT-3 back in that day, that was probably between 1 and 10,000 V100 GPUs from NVIDIA. And it probably took around 1 month of training and between $1 and $10 million to train those models. So really expensive to actually build a base model. The beauty of fine tuning is that, for doing this LoRa based method, you probably only need 1 to 100 GPUs to fine tune a model, and it could take hours or days, not weeks or months to train a single model before it becomes available.
Awesome. And Nick, the $10 million or those ballpark numbers you had given us, does that include also the amount of time you need to spend on engineering the data and preparing the data, or is it just on the training?
That's just on the training cost, right?
Fantastic. Awesome, Nick. Well, I hope our audience enjoyed this version of Unpacked with Nick, where we spoke about many different things as it relates to performance of foundation models. We also spoke about the emergent qualities that we see because of the large training data that these foundation models have had and how you could possibly deploy them and considerations. So, Nick, thank you so much, and hope we see each other again in another podcast.
Yes. Look, every day is a good day to talk about generative AI. So it'll be interesting to come back, 6 or 12 months from now to see how the landscape's changed
Oh, I
since.
would love that.
I
I would
appreciate
love
it.
that.
Have an opportunity, Arvind, really.
Thanks, Nick. Appreciate it.
Really fascinating interview, Arvind. Can you summarize, as always, the key points that we should be thinking about?
Sure, absolutely. Normally I would summarize with 3 points. That's my normal way of summarization. But today with Nick, there were 5 points which were interesting. So
Right.
who am I to prioritize, right? Let the audience prioritize. I'm going to give them all five.
Give us the
Stuart.
full meal.
Right? I'm going to give them all five, but I'll keep it short so that the audience can decide which ones they want to dive into. So I think the first thing that Nick spoke about was the fact that generative AI is almost it's like you should think of it as a general purpose technology versus the traditional AI models, right? Traditional AI models so far solved very narrow problems. So you would have an AI model that only does cancer detection, or you would have an AI model that does only predictive maintenance, right? But today, with generative AI, it is capable of multiple tasks, and that's the beauty of generative AI. And so the problem now becomes, how do you then identify which task to deploy it in, right? Given that it can do pretty much everything, how do you deploy it? And this is where I think the first insight from Nick is, because it's a language-based model, start initially thinking about tasks that involve language, use cases that involve language. That's your low-hanging fruit, right? That's where you go to. And so that was his first insight, right? Any language-based task in a company, you can start thinking of how you can automate some of that with generative AI with some caveats. Now, the second concept that I thought was really important is, normally when you have narrow AI models, you could have a top-down approach where a few people who are in leadership positions or few people who are experts can tell you, use this AI in this particular situation And from top down, you start figuring out how to deploy it, right? But with generative AI, because it can be used across so many use cases in your organization, HR, finance, supply chain, manufacturing, product development, trying to take a top-down approach, telling your employees this is how we should use generative AI, could actually be the wrong strategy to deploy. The right strategy would be a bottoms-up approach where you give everyone access to the technology within your company and let them tell you how it's helping them. Let them figure out, let the employees bottoms up figure out what this technology can do for your company. And there you may have a more successful way of identifying what are the use case of generative AI. I thought that was super important because it's very counterintuitive. It's not how companies operate today, right? The other parts of our conversation was about use cases. The other area of our conversation was how do you pick the right AI model for you, right? And this is where I think with Nick, we spoke a lot about the Goldilocks effect. Like all of us have learned the Goldilocks story, right? Is it a small bowl? Is it a medium-sized bowl? Is it a large bowl? Which one should she pick, right? And she picks the one that's most relevant for her. It's the same thing with AI, right? You have small models, big models, and trying to say that I'm going to use a single model or the most powerful model, for example, today GPT-4, I want to use the most powerful model for every use case is foolhardy, right? So how do you then figure out which AI model to use? First one is hire someone who knows what they're doing in the AI world. Don't make these decisions yourself because figuring out which AI model is an art and a science. It's not that easy. But as a leader, there are 3 things you should know. Number 1, the quality of the AI model. Number 2, the cost of the AI model. And number 3, latency. Based on these 3 things, you match the AI model to your use case, right? That was the third insight from Nick. The last one that Nick spoke about was going back to the story we spoke about, Stuart, which is the conversations and chatbots, right? I think what Nick brought out was a really important insight, which is rather than think about how do you take generative AI and build a better chatbot, maybe what you should be thinking about is how do you take this conversational technology and rebuild an entire website, right? Why would you even have a website and a chatbot, right? What if you redesign the entire website so that it's a conversational interface? Should you even have the website designed the way it is today? So asking those fundamental questions ground up, I think will give leaders new power, new innovation. And I think that's how you should think about generative AI technology. So I think those are some of the insights that came out today. I hope leaders leverage this and make use of it.
Absolutely. So we've got a roadmap there for transformation. It's fascinating stuff. Picking the right AI model for your business. Lots of food for thought there. As always, Arvind, thank you so much for your interview with Nick Brady, and thanks for all your insights in our news section as well.
Of course, Stuart. And don't forget to send me a link to that sweater. I want one too.
I will do. Nice and cozy. So I'll sign off just by saying thanks to everybody for tuning in. If you like our podcast, please like, subscribe, or tell a friend. I'm Stuart Black, and see you next time on Unpacked.